In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. And latrines. Someone has to dig them. Someone has to lime them. Someone has to shovel what needs shoveling and burn what needs burning. That someone volunteered for the job, and he'd like you to know it was the best decision he ever made. For about 6 months. Hey, I'm your brother from the void, and this is Tales from the Void. Today's story belongs to Cradden Velt, 47th Pallenvahr Line Infantry, a former clerk who cried at his own conscription and put his hand up for sanitation details so fast he nearly dislocated his shoulder because his brain translated sanitation into not fighting. He was right. Then he found what was under latrine pit number 11, and he was very, very wrong. It's disgusting. It's hilarious. It's the best war story ever told by a man holding a shovel. Settle in. This is Tales from the Void. Let's begin.
You want to know the worst job in the Imperial Guard? It is not standing on the front line with a lasgun while something the size of a hab-block charges at you. It is not driving a chimera through a minefield, or carrying shells for the basilisks, or even being the poor bastard who has to hold the voxcaster during an artillery barrage. No, the worst job in the Imperial Guard, the one nobody talks about, the one that gets no medals and no remembrance and no mention in the regimental histories, is mine. I am Cradden Velt, Guardsman, 47th Pallenvahr Line Infantry, and I am the man who maintains the field latrines. I dig the pits, I lime the trenches, I shovel what needs shoveling, I burn what needs burning. I do this every single day, and I have done it for 331 days on a world called Kelvessik Four. And if the Emperor has any mercy left in his golden bones, I will do it for 331 more, because the alternative is dying, and I have very strong feelings about not doing that. I volunteered for this. I need you to understand that, because it is the part that makes everyone either laugh at me or look at me like I am something they found on the bottom of their boot, which is a look I am very familiar with given my line of work. I volunteered. When Sergeant Druvek stood in front of our newly minted platoon on the transport deck of the Reliance of Purpose, 5 weeks out from Pallenvahr and already stinking of recycled air and too many bodies packed into too little space, and asked if anyone had sanitation experience, my hand went up so fast I nearly dislocated my own shoulder. I had no sanitation experience. I had been a clerk, a minor records clerk in the Administratum sub-office of Pallenvahr's 7th District, filing tithing reports and stamping cargo manifests, and living a life so boring and so safe that when the founding came and the grey transports of the Departamento Munitorum arrived to take their 10%, I actually cried. Real tears. Standing in a line with 1,000 other men and women who were trying to look brave or at least resigned, and I was crying like a child who had dropped his ration suite in the gutter. The man next to me, a big slab-faced dock worker named Gulve, looked at me with such pure contempt that I almost stopped. Almost. But I did not stop because I was terrified, and when I am terrified, I do not have much control over what my body decides to do, which is a recurring theme in my life and will explain a great deal of what follows. So there I was on the transport, 3 weeks into basic training that mostly consisted of being shouted at and learning which end of the lasgun to point away from yourself, and Sergeant Druvek asked his question, and my hand went up. I did not think about it. I did not weigh the options. I heard the word sanitation, and my brain, my clever, cowardly brain, translated it instantly into not fighting. That was all I needed. The man who volunteered for sanitation detail would not be standing in a firing line. He would not be charging across open ground. He would not be anywhere near the things that killed people. He would be behind the lines, in the rear, in the safest place a guardsman could possibly be while still technically being a guardsman. That was my reasoning. That was my grand strategy. And you know what? I was right. For about 6 months, I was absolutely right, and it was the best decision I ever made. Then I was wrong, and it was the worst decision I ever made. And the distance between those two things is measured in what I found under latrine pit number 11 in the ruins of a place called Ossendrath, and what happened after. Let me tell you about Kelvessik Four, because you need to understand the place, to understand how everything went the way it did. Kelvessik Four is, or was, a minor industrial world in the Threkin subsector, one of those planets that exists solely to produce things for other, more important planets. Munitions, mostly. Small arms ammunition, stub rounds, low-grade explosive charges, the kind of output that fills cargo holds by the 1,000-ton and keeps the war machine grinding forward. Population of about 800 million at last census, spread across a dozen major manufacturing centers and the supporting infrastructure around them. Not a bad world by Imperial standards. Not a good one either. The kind of place where you are born, you work, you tithe, and you die, and the Imperium does not notice you were ever there unless you stop producing. Kelvessik Four stopped producing about 2 years before we arrived because something came up from below the surface and started eating people. And the Planetary Defense Force, for all their enthusiasm and locally manufactured ammunition, could not put it back down. That is why the 47th was sent. That is why 40,000 men and women from Pallenvahr, the 47th and her sister regiments, raised together at the same founding, were packed into transports and hurled across the void to fight on a planet they had never heard of, against an enemy that regimental command described, with magnificent understatement, as Xenos insurgents of indeterminate origin. I learned later what that actually meant. On the transport, we did not know. We knew we were going to fight something that was not human, and that the fight had been going on long enough for the locals to lose. And that was enough to make most of the regiment nervous, and me specifically nauseous. I spent the last week of the voyage alternating between the latrine, using it legitimately, not working on it. My assignment had not started yet, and my bunk, where I lay face down and tried to calculate the statistical probability of surviving a campaign. I was a clerk, remember. Numbers were my comfort. The numbers were not comforting. Average campaign mortality for line infantry regiments in active Xenos engagements sat somewhere between 30 and 60%, depending on the source, and I did not like those odds. I did not like any odds that included a meaningful chance of me being dead at the end of them. Some men in the regiment talked about glory and duty and the Emperor's light. Gulve, the dock worker who had watched me cry at the founding, talked about killing something with his bare hands. Sergeant Druvek talked about unit cohesion and fire discipline and making Pallenvahr proud. I talked to nobody, because nobody wanted to talk to the man on sanitation detail, and I was fine with that. I was more than fine with that. If nobody talked to me, nobody would notice me. And if nobody noticed me, nobody would put me somewhere I could get killed. We made planetfall on the eastern fringe of the Ossendrath manufacturing zone, which had been the first area to fall and was now the primary axis of the Imperial advance. The regiment came down in bulk landers, packed shoulder to shoulder in the hold, while the airframe shook and the hull groaned and someone behind me vomited on someone else's boots. I was carrying a lasgun I had fired exactly 9 times in training, a pack full of sanitation supplies instead of extra ammunition, and a feeling in my stomach like I had swallowed a live rat. The lander touched down on a rockcrete pad that had been cleared by the first wave. The 112th Kelvessik garrison, what was left of them, had held a perimeter long enough for us to land. And the ramp dropped, and the air hit me, and that was my first experience of Kelvessik Four. Gray sky, gray buildings, gray dust on everything, fine as ash, getting in your eyes and your mouth and the creases of your uniform before you had taken 10 steps. The sound of weapons fire somewhere to the north, muffled by distance and the constant low moan of wind through broken buildings. And the smell. Throne, the smell. Kelvessik Four smelled like a furnace that had been used to burn something that should not have been burned, and then left to cool in the rain. Chemical and wet and wrong all at once, layered under the sharper bite of Feistline smoke and the sweet, sick undertone of things that had been dead for a long time and were not improving with age. The 47th's forward operating base was established in what had once been a workers' housing complex on the southern edge of Ossendrath. Rows and rows of identical hab-blocks, 6 stories tall, gray rock crete with small windows, the kind of place that looked depressing when it was intact and looked apocalyptic now that half of it had been shelled into rubble. Regimental command took over the largest intact structure. Companies spread out through the surrounding blocks, supply set up in the basements. The medicae established a field station in what had been a communal dining hall, and I, Cradden Velt, Guardsman and newly appointed sole member of Forward Sanitation Detail 7, was given a spade, a drum of calcium powder, a handbook titled Field Waste Management, Principles and Procedures Abridged, and told to find somewhere suitable to dig the first set of latrines for the 1,200 men and women of 3rd Battalion. I want to be clear about something. When I say field latrine, I am not talking about a refresher unit with running water and a privacy screen. I am not even talking about the chemical reclamation toilets you find on starships, which are terrible but at least have walls. A field latrine is a trench. You dig it, you put boards across it, you put a screen around it if you have the material and the inclination, and men and women squat over it and do what biology demands. When it fills up, you cover it with dirt and lime, and you dig another one. That is it. That is the full scope of the technology involved. Civilizations that can build ships to cross the stars and weapons to crack planets still require someone to dig a hole in the ground for other people to shit in, and on the forward edge of the Ossendrath campaign zone, that someone was me. The first week was the hardest, but not for the reason you might think. The digging was fine. I am not a strong man. I was a clerk, remember, soft hands and a curved spine from years of leaning over a desk. But the ground in Ossendrath was mostly rubble and compacted industrial fill, and once you got through the first half-meter of that, the soil underneath was loose and cooperative. I could dig a regulation latrine trench, 2 meters long by 1 meter wide by 1.5 meters deep, in about 4 hours by myself. The lime application was mechanical. The board laying was simple carpentry that even I could manage. No, the hard part was the smell, and I do not mean the smell of what went into the latrines, though that was considerable. I mean the smell of me. After 3 days of digging and limbing and maintaining the pits for 1,200 soldiers, I smelled like something that should have been burned and buried. I smelled so bad that men who had spent weeks in the field without bathing, men caked in mud and blood and the gray dust of Kelvessik Four, would physically recoil when I walked past. My uniform was stained in ways that no amount of scrubbing could fix. My hands were cracked and raw from the lime despite the gloves, which were standard-issue leather and about as waterproof as a paper sack. And the worst part, the truly miserable part, was that after about 10 days I stopped noticing. My nose surrendered. It gave up. It decided that if this was going to be its life now, it was not going to participate. and it shut down whatever part of the brain is responsible for telling you that you are offensive to every other living thing within a 5-meter radius. I was grateful for that, in a way. The rest of the platoon was not. They called me things. Of course they did. Soldiers are creative when it comes to mockery, and a man whose entire job is managing human waste is an irresistible target. I was the Pit King. I was Lord Shovel. I was His Holiness, the Sanitation Cardinal. I was, most commonly and most simply, Shitman. That one stuck. Sergeant Druvek himself used it, though he had the decency to look slightly uncomfortable about it. Shitman, third pit is overflowing. Sort it out. Shitman, captain wants the officer latrines redug. New location by the east wall. Shitman, there is something growing in number 6. Deal with it before it becomes a medical issue. That was my life. I received orders related to excrement, and I fulfilled them. And in between, I slept in a corner of a supply room that nobody else wanted because it was closest to the pits, and I ate my rations alone because nobody wanted to sit near me. And I was fine. I was fine because I was alive. Every morning I woke up and I was alive, and out beyond the perimeter, the last fire crackled and the heavy weapons thumped, and men screamed and died, and I was alive, and the price of being alive was that I smelled terrible and nobody respected me, and I spent my days knee-deep in the worst things the human body could produce. That was a price I was willing to pay. I would have paid it twice. You learn things about people when you maintain their latrines. You learn things that nobody else knows, because nobody else is paying attention to the things you are paying attention to. I knew, for example, that Captain Morvain of 9th Company was quietly drinking himself to death, because the officer latrine I maintained for his section always had the sharp chemical reek of whatever rot gut he was getting from the supply sergeants, and the man visited it 4 times as often as any other officer. I knew that the Munitorum liaison, a pinch-faced civilian named Gelf, was skimming medical supplies because I found empty stim-pack wrappers in the officer pit that did not match anything in the standard field kit, and Gelf was the only non-military personnel with access to the officer area. I knew that Protin Gulv, the big dock worker who had watched me cry at the founding and who had since become something of a hero in his platoon for being the first man to bayonet one of the Xenos insurgents in close combat, had a stomach condition that he was hiding from the medicae because the evidence in his section's latrine was unmistakable and deeply concerning. I knew all of this, and none of it mattered because I was the shitman, and nobody asked the shitman what he knew. And the shitman did not volunteer information because the shitman had learned very early that the best way to survive was to be invisible, be useful, be disgusting, be beneath notice. The Imperium runs on people who are beneath notice, and I was content to be one of them. Let me tell you about the campaign itself, because it is relevant to what happened later. The Xenos insurgents that the briefing documents had been so vague about turned out to be genestealers. If you do not know what that means, I envy you, but I will explain because I did not know either until I saw one up close, and by then it was far too late for the knowing to do me any good. Genestealers are Xenos, but not in the way most people think of Xenos. They are not like orcs, who come at you in a green tide with choppas and bad attitudes and are at least honest about wanting to kill you. They are not like the Eldar, who are supposedly elegant and ancient and fight wars for reasons too subtle for humans to understand. Genestealers are infiltrators, parasites. They get inside a population, literally and figuratively, and they breed, and they spread, and they corrupt. And by the time anyone notices what is happening, the rot has gone too deep to cut out cleanly. That is what had happened on Kelvessik Four. The cult had been growing for decades, maybe longer, burrowing into the labor force and the underhives and the deep mine complexes, turning workers and their children's children into something that looked human on the surface, but was not. Not really. Not where it counted. When the cult finally rose, it rose everywhere at once, and the Planetary Defense Force, which had been infiltrated almost as thoroughly as the civilian population, folded like wet parchment. The 47th's job was to retake the Ossendrath manufacturing zone, which was one of the primary ammunition production centers and therefore strategically important enough to warrant the expenditure of 40,000 lives. Every regiment Pallenvahr had given to this war. The advance was slow, street by street, building by building, hab-block by hab-block. The Genestealers and their cultist followers knew the ground better than we did, and they fought with a fanaticism that went beyond anything I had been prepared for, which was nothing. Because I had not been prepared for anything, because I was on latrine detail. But I heard the stories. Everyone heard the stories. Men coming back from the front with that hollow look, the one that said they had seen something they could not process. Whole squads disappearing in buildings that should have been cleared. Cultists that looked like ordinary civilians right up until the moment they pulled a weapon or opened their mouth to reveal a jaw full of teeth that no human mouth should contain. And the pure strains, the real genestealers, the ones that were not even pretending to be human anymore. 4 arms, chitinous hides, claws that could open a chimera like a ration tin. Those were the things that lived in my nightmares, the things that made me grateful every single morning that my hands were wrapped around a shovel handle instead of a lasgun grip. The advance stalled about 2 months in. We had pushed through the outer residential districts and into the fringe of the industrial core, but the resistance was thickening and casualties were mounting, and regimental command decided to consolidate. The base was expanded, more troops moved in. The perimeter was hardened with earthworks and wire and weapon emplacements, and suddenly my 1,200 men became 3,000, and my workload tripled. And Sergeant Druvek, in a moment of what he probably considered generosity, assigned me an assistant. His name was Fenwick Drosh, and he was, if such a thing is possible, an even bigger coward than me. Fenwick was from the agri-processing district on Pallenvahr, a thin, nervous man with a perpetual twitch in his left eye, and hands that shook when he was anxious, which was always. He had been assigned to latrine detail as punishment for what his sergeant delicately described as failure to advance under fire, which meant he had frozen during his first engagement and had to be physically dragged to cover by his squad mates while the enemy shot at them. I liked him immediately, not because he was good company. He was terrible company. He barely spoke, and when he did, it was to say something miserably pessimistic about our chances of survival, but because he made me feel better about myself. Next to Fenwick Drosh, I was practically a hero. I had at least volunteered for my humiliation. Fenwick had been sentenced to his. There was one odd thing about him, though, and I did not think about it at the time because I was too busy being grateful for the help. On his first day, before I had shown him the layout, before I had given him the map of the pit positions I had drawn up, he walked straight to Pit 4 without asking directions. When I mentioned it, he blinked and said he must have seen a layout posted somewhere. And I accepted that because it was a reasonable explanation and because I was not in the habit of questioning reasonable explanations. I would think about that moment later. I would think about it a great deal. Together, we developed a routine. Wake before dawn, check the overnight accumulation, lime the active pits, dig new trenches if needed, maintain the board covers which had a tendency to crack and split and occasionally collapse under the weight of a particularly large guardsman, resulting in incidents that were horrifying for everyone involved, and which I will not describe in detail because some memories are too vivid to share. Midday, we would eat our rations, always upwind of the pits, always sitting on something elevated, always quickly, because the flies on Kelvessik Four were the size of your thumbnail and twice as persistent. Afternoon was for the deeper work, burning waste in the designated incineration pits, relimbing the filled trenches, doing the chemical treatments that the handbook recommended for disease prevention, checking the drainage channels that we had dug to keep rainwater from flooding the active pits, and turning the entire sanitation area into something out of a Nurgle worshipper's fever dream. Evening was for repairs, maintenance, and the slow, grinding misery of existing in a place where everything smelled bad and nobody wanted you around. But here is the thing. Here is the thing that I did not expect, that caught me off guard more than anything else in the entire campaign. I was good at it. I do not mean adequate. I do not mean competent in the baseline sense that I fulfilled my duties without causing a medical emergency. I mean I was genuinely, measurably, unexpectedly good at managing field sanitation. My latrine pits lasted longer than regulation predicted. My lime ratios kept disease rates in 3rd Battalion at less than half the regimental average. My drainage systems actually worked, which apparently put me ahead of every other sanitation detail in the regiment, most of whom were staffed by men who had been punished rather than volunteers, and who therefore did the minimum possible and nothing more. The battalion medicae, a severe woman named Surgeon Lieutenant Helvane, told Sergeant Druvek that my work was saving more lives than most of the fighting platoons, which was probably true in a statistical sense, but which did not make me feel better about my life choices. Because being told you are the best latrine digger in the regiment is like being told you are the tallest man in a pit. It is technically a compliment, but it does not get you out of the pit. Surgeon Lieutenant Helvane started visiting my section regularly after that, checking my procedures against the handbook standards and finding, apparently to her considerable surprise, that I was exceeding them. She was the first person in the entire regiment who spoke to me like I was a human being rather than a piece of equipment that happened to be shaped like a man. She asked my name, my real name. Not Shitman, not Pit King, not any of the other charming appellations my comrades had bestowed upon me. Cradden Velt, I told her, and she nodded and wrote it down in her records, and I felt something that I had not felt since before the founding, which was the faint, dangerous warmth of being seen. She was the one who told me about the old infrastructure. Ossendrath, she explained, had been a proper manufacturing settlement before the war, with proper underground utilities, water mains, sewage systems, drainage conduits, the whole network that makes a city function. Most of it had been damaged or destroyed in the fighting, but some of it was still intact beneath the surface, sealed off by the rubble above but still structurally sound. She mentioned it because she wanted me to check whether any of my latrine pits were inadvertently draining into the old sewer network, which could contaminate groundwater that the regiment might need to use if the supply lines were cut. A practical concern, a medical concern, nothing more. I said I would check. I did not want to check. Checking meant going underground, and going underground on a planet infested with genestealers was, to my mind, approximately equivalent to volunteering to be eaten. But Surgeon Lieutenant Helvane had asked me nicely, and she had used my real name, and that combination of things was apparently enough to override my survival instincts, which tells you something about how desperate I was for basic human decency. The first time I went underground, Fenwick came with me, which was a mistake for both of us, but worse for him because Fenwick Drosh had a fear of enclosed spaces that he had not previously disclosed, possibly because nobody had previously asked him to enter one. We found the access point behind latrine pit number 4, where a section of collapsed flooring had revealed a maintenance shaft leading down into the old sewer system. The shaft was about 1.5 meters across, lined with corroded metal, and descended roughly 4 meters into darkness. I had a hand lamp. Fenwick had a hand lamp and a facial expression that suggested He would rather be literally anywhere else in the galaxy, including the front line. "This is fine," I told him as we climbed down the rusted ladder, which was not fine. And he knew it was not fine, and I knew he knew. But saying things are fine when they are not fine is one of the essential skills of survival in the Imperial Guard, and I had become very proficient at it. The sewer system beneath our section of the base was old. Properly old, not just war-damaged old, but built a century ago and maintained by people who did not care old. The main tunnel was about 2 meters in diameter, arched overhead, constructed from prefabricated rockcrete sections that had been joined together with some kind of sealant that had long since cracked and crumbled. The floor was covered in a thin layer of stagnant water, maybe 10 centimeters deep, black and still and reflecting our lamplight back at us in a way that made the tunnel feel deeper and longer than it actually was. It smelled, of course it smelled. It was a sewer. But it smelled different from the latrines. Older, mustier, with an organic undertone that reminded me of the deep storage vaults in the Administratum sub-office where I had worked, where records were kept in climate-sealed containers, and the air had that particular staleness that comes from being breathed by nobody for a very long time. The good news, from Surgeon Lieutenant Helvain's perspective, was that my latrine pits were not draining into the sewer network. The ground between the pit bottoms and the tunnel ceiling was solid enough, and the drainage channels I had dug were directing waste runoff away from the access points. I could have stopped there. I should have stopped there. The sensible, cowardly, self-preserving thing to do would have been to climb back up the ladder, report my findings to the surgeon lieutenant, and never think about the old sewers again. But something caught my eye as I was turning to leave, and that something changed everything. There was a mark on the wall. Not damage, not a crack, not the natural degradation of old rockcrete. A mark. Deliberate, scratched into the surface at about chest height, maybe 15 centimeters long, a curved line with 3 shorter lines branching off it. It could have been nothing. It could have been a maintenance mark, a worker's tag, some meaningless graffiti left by a sewer technician decades ago. But I had spent 3 months listening to briefings that I was not technically supposed to attend, but could overhear from my position near the officer latrines, and I had heard the intelligence officers describe cult symbology, and the mark on that wall looked enough like the simplified version of a Genestealer Cult patriarch's psychic sigil that my stomach dropped through my boots and into the black water at my feet. "Fenwick," I said very calmly, because when I am truly terrified, I become very calm, which is the opposite of what happens when I am moderately terrified, when I cry and shake and generally make a spectacle of myself. Fenwick looked at me. "We need to leave," I said. "Now." He did not argue. He did not ask why. He just turned and moved for the ladder with a speed and purpose that I had never seen from him before and would not see again until much later, under circumstances that were considerably worse. Back on the surface, standing in the gray daylight with the familiar stink of the latrine pits around me, like a foul but comforting blanket, I had a decision to make. I could report what I had found, which would mean explaining to someone in authority that I had gone underground without orders, that I had found what might be a cult marking in the old sewer system, and that I, Cradden Velt, the shitman, the man whose military contribution consisted entirely of digging holes for other people to use as toilets, was now claiming to have intelligence about a potential enemy presence beneath the base. Or I could say nothing, fill in the access point, and pretend I had never seen it. You can guess which option my instincts preferred. But the mark bothered me. It sat in my head like a splinter, small and sharp, and every time I tried to stop thinking about it, it dug in deeper. Because if there were genestealers beneath the base, not outside the perimeter, not in the ruined buildings of Ossendrath, but beneath us, right under our feet, separated from 3,000 sleeping guardsmen by nothing more than a few meters of dirt and old rockcrete. Then the latrines would not save me. The safest place in the regiment would not be safe at all. And if I was not safe, then what was the point of any of it? What was the point of the smell and the shame and the loneliness and the terrible grinding indignity of being the man who shovels excrement while other men fight and die? If I was going to die anyway, I wanted to at least die knowing I had done something, and the fact that this was the first time in my life I had felt that way should tell you how frightened I was. I went back down the next day, alone this time because Fenwick had developed a sudden and conveniently timed illness that prevented him from doing anything except lying in his bunk and staring at the ceiling with the haunted expression of a man who has been asked to do something unreasonable and has decided that passive resistance is his only option. I did not blame him. I wished I could do the same. But the splinter was in my head, and it would not come out, and so I climbed down the rusted ladder with my hand lamp in one hand and my lasgun, which I had retrieved from the storage rack where it had sat untouched for 3 months, still with the 9 training shots as its total firing history, in the other, and I went looking for more marks. I found them. Not many, and not close together, but enough. Scratched into the tunnel walls at irregular intervals, always at chest height, always the same basic shape, the curved line with branching strokes, like a simplified claw or a reaching hand. Some were old, faded, barely visible against the grimy rockcrete. Others were newer, sharper, cut deeper into the surface, as if the hand that made them had been more confident, or more urgent, or both. I followed them deeper into the tunnel network, moving south and east, away from the base, into sections where the water was deeper and the air was thicker, and the darkness pressed in around my lamplight like something physical, something with weight and intent. I am not a brave man, I have made that clear, but fear has a strange quality that nobody tells you about, which is that if you are afraid for long enough, if the fear becomes your constant companion, your baseline, the background noise of your existence, it stops being paralyzing and starts being merely present. You do not stop being afraid. You never stop being afraid. But you learn to walk with it, to act despite it, to do things that a rational person would not do because the alternative, living with the not knowing with the splinter in your head, becomes worse than the fear itself. That is not bravery. I want to be clear about that. That is just a different kind of cowardice, the cowardice of a man who is more afraid of uncertainty than he is of the dark. The tunnel network was larger than I expected. It branched and forked and split into subsidiary channels, a whole underground geography that mirrored the manufacturing settlement above. Some sections had collapsed entirely, blocked by rubble and standing water that went from ankle-deep to waist-deep, and forced me to turn back. Others were clear, structurally sound, stretching away into distances that my lamp could not reach. I mapped them in my head as best I could, using the clerk's memory for layout and organization that had once been my only professional skill, and was now apparently my only useful trait. The main trunk ran roughly north-south under what had been the primary residential boulevard. Subsidiary tunnels branched east and west under the hab-blocks, connecting to smaller maintenance shafts and drainage channels. It was a functional system, well-designed if poorly maintained, and it had clearly been large enough and intact enough for someone, or something, to use as a network of hidden pathways running beneath the entire Ossendrath district. On the 3rd day of my unauthorized underground expeditions, I found the chamber. It was where the main trunk intersected with a larger conduit, a junction room about 5 meters across with a vaulted ceiling and access hatches on 3 sides. The water here was deeper, almost to my knees, and warmer than it should have been, which was a detail my brain registered and then immediately wished it had not. The walls of the chamber were covered in marks, not the simple scratches I had seen in the tunnels, but elaborate designs, spiraling patterns that radiated outward from a central point like the arms of a galaxy or the legs of a spider. They had been carved into the rockcrete with something harder than metal, something that left grooves deep enough to fit my finger, and they covered every surface from the water line to the ceiling. In the center of the chamber, just below the surface of the dark water, I could see something large and pale, and my lamplight, reflecting off it, made it look almost like it was moving, breathing, alive. I thought of them as eggs. I learned later they were something else. Biomass nodes the Ordo Xenos took away in sealed containers and refused to discuss, growths that had no name in any briefing I had ever overheard. But at the time, standing in that water with my lamp shaking in my hand, eggs was the closest word my brain could find. The handbook on field waste management was understandably silent on the subject. What I saw was a mass of translucent, fist-sized spheres arranged in a rough cluster, attached to the tunnel floor by strands of something that looked like dried mucus and surrounded by the carved symbols and the deep black water. And the whole scene was so wrong, so fundamentally and viscerally wrong, that my body made the decision to leave before my brain had finished processing what it was looking at. I was up the ladder and back on the surface in what felt like seconds, gasping and shaking, my hands trembling so badly that I dropped my lamp and had to fish it out of the mud. And Fenwick, who had apparently recovered from his convenient illness, just in time to see me emerge from the access shaft looking like I had seen the face of the ruinous powers themselves, said one word, "Bad?" And I said yes. And that was the entire conversation, because what else was there to say? I had to tell someone. I knew I had to tell someone. The eggs in the tunnel, the cult markings, the whole underground network. This was bigger than me, bigger than my fear, bigger than my desire to be invisible and safe and ignored. If there were genestealers nesting beneath the base, the entire regiment was in danger. 3,000 men and women sleeping above a nest. I had to tell someone, and that someone had to be someone with the authority to do something about it. The problem was that the someone I needed to tell was unlikely to listen to me, because I was the shitman. And the shitman's opinions on strategic threats carried approximately the same weight as the contents of his latrine pits. But I had to try. I had to. I went to Sergeant Druvek first because he was my immediate superior and because the chain of command existed for a reason, and because, if I am being honest, I was too intimidated to go higher without being told to. Druvek was a solid man, competent, fair, in the way that sergeants are fair, which means he distributed misery equally and did not play favorites. He was also deeply uninterested in anything I had to say that did not relate to the state of the latrines. I found him in the platoon command post, a sandbagged room on the ground floor of one of the hab-blocks, going over duty rosters with Corporal Meccan. "Sergeant," I said, "I need to report something." He looked at me. He looked at the state of my uniform, which was its usual state. He looked at Corporal Meccan, who was already edging away from me because the smell preceded me into any enclosed space by several seconds. "Is it about the pits?" he asked. "No," I said. "It is about what is under the pits." I told him. I told him about the tunnels, the marks, the chamber, the eggs. I told him everything as clearly and as concisely as I could, in the language of a clerk delivering a report, because that was the only way I knew how to present information, and because I thought that if I sounded professional and composed, he might take me seriously. He listened. He did not interrupt. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time, and then he said, "Velt, have you been drinking?" I had not been drinking. I told him I had not been drinking. He looked at me with an expression that was not quite contempt, but was in the same neighborhood, and he told me to go back to my pits and stop crawling around in old sewers and to come back when I had something real to report, and not the nightmares of a man who had spent too long breathing lime fumes. I thought about going to Surgeon Lieutenant Helvane, because she had at least treated me with a degree of respect, but she was medical staff, not command staff, and even if she believed me, she had no authority to order a search of the tunnel network. I thought about going to the intelligence section, but the intelligence section was staffed by officers who would want to know why a guardsman on sanitation detail was conducting unauthorized reconnaissance in restricted underground spaces, and that conversation would likely end with me being disciplined rather than listened to. I thought about going to the commissar, and then I thought about it some more. And then I decided that going to the commissar was the absolute last thing I wanted to do, because Commissar Branneth Hull was the kind of man who made problems go away by making the people who brought the problems go away. And I had a very strong preference for continuing to exist. So I did what any rational coward would do in my situation. I went back underground. If nobody would listen to my words, I needed proof. Something physical, something undeniable, something I could put on a desk in front of someone with rank and say, "This is real, and you need to deal with it." I did not want to go back down there. Every nerve in my body was screaming at me not to go back down there, but the splinter in my head had become a spike, and the spike was telling me that those eggs were going to hatch, and when they hatched, whatever came out of them was going to come up through the same access points I used every day, and it was going to come up into the latrines, and the latrines were where I lived, and I was not going to die squatting over a pit in the dark because I had been too afraid to act when I had the chance. Even my cowardice had limits, apparently, and the limit was dying in a latrine. I went down on the fourth day with a satchel and a field knife and a plan that I had assembled in the way that only a truly desperate person assembles a plan, which is to say I was going to improvise and hope. The tunnels were the same. Dark, wet, quiet. The marks on the walls were the same, but something was different. I felt it before I understood it, that animal instinct that lives in the back of your brain where the rational clerk's mind cannot reach. The one that tells you the room you just walked into is not empty, even though your eyes say it is. The water in the tunnels was disturbed, not flowing. There was no current, no drainage, no movement of water in the normal sense, but rippled. Patterns on the surface that did not match my footsteps, that suggested something else had moved through here recently. Something heavy, something large. I almost turned back. And if I had turned back, everything that happened afterwards would have been different, and many people who died would not have died, and many people who lived would not have lived, and I would still be the shit man, digging pits and liming trenches and being comfortable in my cowardice. But I did not turn back. I kept going because the chamber with the eggs was close, and I needed one of those eggs, just one, something I could carry back to the surface and show to someone who would recognize it for what it was. One egg. That was all I needed. I reached the chamber junction. I turned my lamp toward the center of the room where the clutch had been. The eggs were gone. The cluster of translucent spheres that I had seen 2 days ago, attached to the tunnel floor in their mucus cradle, was gone. The strands were still there, broken and limp, hanging from the floor like the roots of a plant that had been ripped out. The water where the eggs had sat was cloudy, milky white, and the carvings on the walls seemed deeper than before, fresher, as if something had been adding to them. And in the far corner of the chamber, in the darkness beyond my lamp's reach, something breathed. I heard it, a low, wet, rasping sound, like air being drawn through a throat full of fluid, and it was close, much too close. And my body did the thing it does when I am truly terrified, which is to freeze completely, every muscle locked, every joint rigid like a prey animal, hoping that if it stays still enough, the predator will not see it. I stood in the knee-deep water with my lamp pointed at the empty clutch, and my lasgun hanging from its strap, and my bowels doing things that were entirely appropriate given my occupation. And I listened to the breathing, and I waited for death. Death did not come. The breathing continued, and then it moved, not toward me but away, receding into the tunnel on the far side of the chamber, and I heard the water shift as something large displaced it, and then there was silence, and I was alone. I stood there for a long time. I do not know how long, long enough for the shaking to start, for the freezing to break and the trembling to take its place, and when I could move again, I moved very quickly and very quietly back the way I had come, and I did not stop until I was on the surface, in the daylight, with the solid, dirty ground of the base under my boots, and the stink of the latrines around me, like the sweetest perfume in the Imperium. The eggs had hatched, or they had been moved. Either way, they were gone, and whatever had been in them was now in the tunnels, and I had just stood in a room with something that was alive, and large, and breathing, and it had not killed me. And I did not know if that was because it had not seen me, or because it had seen me and decided I was not worth the effort, or because it was waiting, and none of those options were good. I sat on the edge of latrine pit number 3, and I shook and I tried to think, and thinking was hard because my brain was doing the thing where it replayed the sound of that breathing over and over, the wet, rasping rhythm of it. And every time it replayed it, the breathing got louder and closer and more real. Fenwick found me there. He sat down next to me, which was unusual because Fenwick generally avoided sitting next to anything, including me, and he said, "You went down again." It was not a question. "Yes," I said. "You found something worse." Also not a question. "Yes," I said. He was quiet for a while, and then he said, very softly, "Was the water warm?" I looked at him. I had not mentioned the warm water. I had not described the chamber to him at all, not this time, not after this visit. I had told him about the marks after the first expedition, yes, but nothing about the temperature of the water, nothing about the chamber specifically. "What?" I said. He twitched, that left eye flutter, and shook his head. "Nothing. I just assumed. Stagnant water underground, closed space, no ventilation. It would be warm." It was a reasonable explanation. It was the second reasonable explanation Fenwick had given me for knowing something he should not have known, and I accepted it again because I needed to accept it, because the alternative was that my only companion in the worst posting in the regiment was something other than what he appeared to be, and I was not ready for that thought. Not yet. I tried one more time to go through official channels. I went to Sergeant Druvek again, and this time I brought Fenwick, on the theory that 2 witnesses were harder to dismiss than 1. Druvek listened again, with less patience than before, and when I described the empty clutch and the breathing in the dark, his expression shifted from irritation to something that might have been concern, or might have been the look a man gives a subordinate he is about to have evaluated for psychological fitness. "Velt," he said, "you are telling me that you have been conducting solo patrols in a known unstable underground structure in an active combat zone without authorization or support, and that you have encountered what you believe to be xenomorphic organisms, and that you want me to divert frontline resources to investigate sewers based on your word." I said yes, that was essentially what I was telling him. He told me that he would pass it up the chain, and that in the meantime I was to stop going underground, and that if I went underground again he would put me on the front line regardless of my sanitation assignment, because at least on the front line my propensity for seeing things in the dark would be useful. He passed it up the chain. I know he did because 2 days later I was summoned to the battalion command post, which was in the basement of the largest intact hab-block, and I stood in front of Major Tessavaun, the 3rd Battalion commanding officer, and I gave my report for the 3rd time. Major Tessavaun was a career officer, The kind of man who had been born into the officer class on Pallenvahr and had been groomed for command since childhood. He had a thin face, thin hair, thin patience, and an aide-de-camp named Lieutenant Prothvin, who stood behind him and took notes on a data slate, and never once looked at me directly. The major heard me out. He asked questions, sharp, specific questions about the tunnel layout, the markings, the eggs, the breathing. He asked me to describe the chamber in detail. He asked about the depth, the water level, the air quality. He asked about the markings on the walls, their size, their arrangement, their consistency. He was thorough, he was professional, and when I was finished, he nodded and said, "Thank you, Guardsman. You are dismissed. Lieutenant Prothvin will note this in the intelligence log. Return to your duties." And that was it. No investigation, no tunnel search, no reinforcement of the underground access points. Just a note in a log that nobody would read, filed by a lieutenant who had not looked at me once. I should have let it go. I should have done what I was told, gone back to my pits, gone back to being the shit man who was invisible and safe and beneath notice. But something had changed in me, knowing something terrible and being unable to make anyone else know it. That was worse than the breathing in the dark. That was a helplessness that made the fear seem almost comfortable by comparison. It was 5 days after my meeting with Major Tessavain. 5 days of routine, 5 days of digging and limbing and pretending that everything was normal while the splinter in my head throbbed and pulsed and refused to let me sleep. I was maintaining latrine pit number 11, the furthest from the main camp, the one that served the outer perimeter guard details and was therefore the least visited and the most neglected. Pit 11 was problematic. It flooded easily, it drained poorly, and it was situated on a patch of ground that was more rubble than soil, which made digging difficult and maintenance a constant struggle. I was relimbing the edges when I noticed that the drainage channel I had dug 3 weeks earlier, the one that was supposed to direct runoff away from the pit and into a soak-away trench, had been altered. Not damaged, not collapsed, altered. Someone had redirected it. The channel now led not to the soak-away trench, but to a depression about 10 meters north of the pit, behind a collapsed section of wall, where the ground had been recently disturbed. I followed the channel to the depression and found a new access point into the underground tunnel network. Not the one I had been using, not the maintenance shaft behind Pit 4. This one was different. This one was wider, nearly 2 meters across, with a ramp of packed earth leading down into the dark, smooth and well-trodden, as if heavy things had been moving up and down it regularly. And at the top of the ramp, half concealed by rubble, was a locking mechanism. Imperial design, standard regimental issue, the kind of lock that was used on supply containers and ammunition stores and other things that the Guard wanted to keep secure. Someone had installed a lock on an access point to the tunnels, someone in the regiment, someone with access to Imperial equipment, someone who knew the tunnels were there and was not reporting them, but was instead using them, and who had redirected my drainage channel to conceal the entrance. I crouched behind the collapsed wall and stared at that lock, and my clerk's brain, the one that was good with numbers and patterns and cross-referencing data, started working despite my terror. The engineering platoon had surveyed the underground access points during base setup. They had declared them structurally compromised. They had sealed the major ones. But this one was not sealed. This one was open and locked, and someone was using it. The engineering survey had been supervised by Captain Morvain of 9th Company, the man I knew was drinking himself to death. The survey report had been reviewed by Major Tessavain's staff, including Lieutenant Prothvin, the man who had taken notes on my report without looking at me, and Major Tessavain himself, who had asked such detailed, specific, professional questions about the tunnels, Questions that now, in retrospect, did not sound like the questions of a man hearing about something for the first time. They sounded like the questions of a man checking how much someone else knew about something he already knew about. The realization hit me like a fist to the stomach, and I actually sat down in the mud because my legs stopped working. Someone in command already knew about the tunnels, already knew what was down there, and was not acting on it, was actively concealing it. The lock on the access point, the redirected drainage channel, the dismissed reports, the note in a log that nobody would read. It all fit together with the terrible precision of a puzzle that you did not want to solve, and the picture it made was this. The Genestealer Cult had not just infiltrated the civilian population of Kelvessik Four. It had infiltrated the 47th Pallenvahr Line Infantry. It was here, in the regiment, in the command structure, and it was using the tunnels to move and communicate and grow, and the only person who knew was a coward who dug latrines and could not get anyone to listen to him because nobody listened to the shit man. I spent the next 2 days in a state of paralysis that was different from my usual cowardice. My usual cowardice was comfortable, practiced, almost habitual. The instinctive flinch away from danger, the automatic calculation of the safest route, the constant quiet negotiation with my own survival instinct. This was something else. This was the paralysis of a man who has suddenly discovered that the walls of his fortress are made of paper, that the ground under his feet is hollow, that the people above him in the chain of command who are supposed to protect him are part of the thing he needs protecting from. I went through my routines mechanically. I dug, I limed, I maintained. I spoke to nobody. Fenwick noticed. Of course Fenwick noticed, because Fenwick had the nervous sensitivity of a man who spent his entire life watching for signs of impending doom, and a sudden change in my behavior was exactly the kind of sign he was calibrated to detect. "You stopped going down," he said on the second evening, as we sat eating our rations in the thin gray light of a Kelvessik sunset. "Yes," I said. "That is worse," he said. "You stopping is worse than you going." He was right, and we both knew it, and neither of us said anything else. I needed to think, not react, not panic, not run. Think. The clerk's brain needed to do what it did best. Organize information and draw conclusions. So I organized. I made lists in my head because putting them on paper was too dangerous. What I knew, what I did not know, who I could trust. The third list was the shortest. It had 2 names on it, mine and Fenwick's, and I was not entirely sure about mine. The obvious answer was the commissar. Commissar Branneth Hull was, by definition, the one man in the regiment whose loyalty to the Imperium was supposed to be beyond question. That was the entire point of commissars. They were watchdogs, morale enforcers, the Emperor's eyes and ears within the ranks, and their job was precisely this, to identify and eliminate threats from within. But going to the commissar meant going over Major Tessavane's head, and if the major was involved in the concealment, he would know. And if the commissar was also compromised, and I had to consider that possibility, because the whole point of a Genestealer cult was that you never knew how deep it went, then I would be reporting the threat to the threat itself, and I would disappear, and nobody would notice, because I was the shit man, and nobody noticed the shit man. I needed proof. Not the verbal report of a terrified latrine digger, not a description of marks on walls and sounds in the dark, but physical, undeniable evidence that I could put in someone's hands and say, "Look at this, and tell me I am imagining things." And I realized, with the kind of cold clarity that comes when your options have been narrowed to a single ugly point, that the only place to get that proof was back in the tunnels. I had to go back down. The thought made me physically ill. I leaned over the edge of pit number 6 and lost my rations into a place where lost rations were at least contextually appropriate. And Fenwick watched me without comment, because Fenwick understood that sometimes the body needs to express what the mind cannot articulate. The next morning, before dawn, I went to the new access point, the one with the lock, the one behind Pit 11. I did not go back through the maintenance shaft behind Pit 4. I did not go to the chamber. I was not that brave, and I was not that stupid, and the two things were functionally identical in my case. I needed to see what was on the other side of that lock. I needed to understand the scope of what I was dealing with. The lock was standard regimental issue, a 6-pin tumbler mechanism that was supposed to be pick-proof, but was actually vulnerable to anyone with a thin piece of wire and 10 minutes of patience, which I knew because the storage rooms in the Administratum sub-office on Pallenvahr had used the same model. And I had once spent an entire afternoon picking one after a colleague lost the key, and the requisition for a replacement would have taken 6 weeks. My hands were shaking so badly that it took me 20 minutes instead of 10, but the lock opened and I descended the ramp into the dark. The tunnel on the other side of the lock was different from the ones I had explored before. It was wider, more recently maintained, with the walls scraped clean of the mineral deposits and biological growth that covered the older sections. The water on the floor was shallower, channeled into a central gutter, and the path on either side was dry and clear. Someone was maintaining this tunnel. Someone was keeping it passable, usable, clean. I followed it south, away from the camp, for what I estimated was about 300 meters, and then it opened into a space that made me stop and stare and forget, for a moment, how afraid I was. It was a junction hub, much larger than the chamber where I had found the eggs. Maybe 20 meters across, circular, with a high domed ceiling that was beyond the reach of my lamp. The walls were carved with the same spiraling patterns I had seen before, but here they were not crude scratches. They were elaborate, almost beautiful, flowing designs that covered every surface and seemed to move in the lamplight, shifting and turning as the shadows played across them. The floor was clear, dry, smooth, and around the edges of the hub, arranged in a semicircle, were crates. Imperial Guard supply crates, ammunition boxes, ration packs, medical supplies, communications equipment, all of it marked with the regimental insignia of the 47th Pallenvahr Line Infantry, all of it sealed and stacked and organized with a precision that my clerk's brain recognized and admired, even as the rest of me recoiled in horror. This was a supply dump. A hidden, underground, carefully maintained supply dump, stocked with Imperial material that had been diverted from the regiment's own stores, and it was sitting in the middle of a Genestealer Cult ritual space. The implications were staggering. This was not a minor infiltration. This was not a few compromised individuals hiding cult markings in abandoned tunnels. This was organized, systematic, sustained. Someone with access to regimental supply chains was diverting material into the tunnels. Someone with authority was maintaining this space, keeping it secret, keeping it supplied. The cult was not just below the base, it was inside the base, inside the structure of the regiment itself, wearing Imperial uniforms and drawing Imperial rations and sleeping in Imperial bunks. And it was feeding the thing below, preparing for something. I did not want to know what it was preparing for, but I took note of the crate markings and serial numbers because that was what clerks did, and I left. And I sealed the lock behind me, and I went back to my pits, and I sat there in the early morning light and tried not to scream. The crate markings told a story. I spent the next day cross-referencing them against what I could remember of the regimental supply manifests, which I had glimpsed during my occasional visits to the supply section to requisition more lime and calcium powder. The numbers were sequential. They belonged to a batch of supplies that had been logged as consumed in forward operations, a standard bookkeeping entry that was used when materiel was expended in combat and could not be accounted for individually. It was the kind of entry that a clerk would make when they needed to make numbers disappear without anyone asking questions. And it was the kind of entry that could only be authorized by someone with supply chain authority, which meant either the quartermaster sergeant or someone in the battalion command staff. I was running out of time, and I knew it. The eggs had hatched. The thing in the chamber was alive and moving. The cult was active, organized, and embedded in the regiment. And I, Cradden Velt, was sitting on all of this information with no way to use it, and no one to give it to, and the helplessness was eating me alive, chewing on my insides like the fear had chewed on them, but worse, because fear at least had the decency to be simple. This was not simple. This was a web, and I was a fly, and the web was so big that I could not see its edges. It was Surgeon Lieutenant Helvane who broke the deadlock, though she did not know it. She came to inspect my latrines on the 5th day after my discovery of the supply dump, and she found me sitting on the edge of Pit 3, staring at nothing, my routine abandoned for the first time in 340-something days. "Guardsman Velt," she said, "your number 6 pit has not been limed today." I looked at her, and I must have looked bad because her expression changed from professional irritation to something softer, something closer to concern. "Guardsman, are you injured?" I was not injured. I was something worse than injured. I was in possession of knowledge that I could not share, and could not act on, and could not ignore, and it was killing me in slow increments. I opened my mouth. I closed it. I opened it again. And then, because I had no other option, and because she had once used my real name, and because that single act of basic human respect had bought more loyalty from me than the entire Imperial chain of command had managed in a year of service, I told her everything. All of it. The tunnels, the marks, the eggs, the breathing, the lock, the supply dump, the crate numbers, the major's questions, the dismissed reports, all of it, in a whispered rush while we stood next to a latrine pit in the gray morning light of Kelvessik Four. She did not tell me I was imagining things. She did not look at me like I was insane. She looked at me with an expression that I later identified as the look of a person doing rapid calculations involving very large and very dangerous variables. And then she said very quietly, "Do not tell anyone else. Do not go underground again. Continue your routine as normal. I will handle this." And she left. I did not know what "I will handle this" meant. I did not know if it meant she believed me or if it meant she was going to have me quietly sedated and sent to a psych evaluation facility behind the lines. I did not know if she was trustworthy or compromised or simply out of her depth. But she had listened and she had not dismissed me, and in that moment that was enough. I went back to my routine. I limed Pit 6. I checked the drainage channels. I burned the daily waste. I did everything the way I always did it, and I waited. And the waiting was the hardest thing I had ever done. Harder than going underground, harder than standing in the chamber with the breathing, because waiting required a kind of courage that I had never been asked to exercise before. The courage to trust someone else with the one thing that mattered. 3 days later, Surgeon Lieutenant Helvane found me again. She had a different expression this time. Harder, tighter. The look of a woman who had been pulling threads and found that they led somewhere she did not want to go. She sat down next to me on the supply crate that served as my dining chair, which was something no one had ever voluntarily done before, and she told me what she had found. She had gone to the regimental medicae records. Specifically, she had pulled the medical files of every member of Major Tessavane's staff, the supply section personnel, and the engineering platoon that had conducted the original tunnel survey. She had found anomalies, not obvious ones, nothing so crude as a physical mutation or a failed blood screening, but patterns, subtle deviations in baseline health metrics that, when viewed in aggregate and over time, Suggested exposure to something that the standard screenings were not calibrated to detect. Hormone fluctuations, minor cranial asymmetries, elevated lymphatic markers. Individually, each anomaly was within normal variation. Together, they painted a picture that made the hair on my arms stand up. "How many?" I asked. She gave me a number. It was not a small number. It was a number that meant the infiltration was not limited to a few individuals in positions of authority. It was a number that meant the 47th Pallenvahr Line Infantry had a sickness in its bones, and the sickness had been there for longer than anyone had suspected, possibly from before the founding, from Pallenvahr itself. The cult had been seeded on our home world, and when the regiment was raised, it came with us, packaged inside the bodies and minds of men and women who did not know what they were carrying, who might not even know they were compromised, because that was how genestealer cults worked. They grew from within. They spread through blood and faith and the slow erosion of identity, and by the time you could see them, it was already too late. "What do we do?" I asked, and the question sounded pathetic even to me, the whine of a child asking a parent to make the monsters go away. Surgeon Lieutenant Helvane looked at me, and for the first time I saw something in her expression that I recognized, because I saw it in the mirror every morning. She was afraid, not the performative anxiety of someone dealing with a stressful situation, but real fear, the bone-deep, gut-twisting, sleep-destroying fear of someone who had just realized that the world was much worse than she had thought. "The commissar," she said. "We go to the commissar, and we bring everything." I must have made a face because she put a hand on my arm, which was the first time anyone had voluntarily touched me since I had started this job. And she said, "Braneth Hull is a hard man, but he is the Emperor's man. If there is one person in this regiment we can be certain is not compromised, it is him." She paused. "And even if he is, the alternatives are worse." We went to the commissar at dusk. Not through the chain of command, not with an appointment, not through any of the normal channels that would give the compromised command staff time to intercept us. Helvane simply walked into the commissar's quarters, which were in a separate hab-block away from the battalion command post, and I followed her, carrying a data slate onto which she had loaded her medical findings and onto which I had, at her instruction, typed everything I knew about the tunnels in the precise, structured format of an administratum. Incident report, because old habits die hard, and because being a clerk is the only thing I have ever been truly good at. Commissar Braneth Hull was sitting behind a field desk, reading casualty reports by the light of a single lumen strip. And when we walked in unannounced, he did not look surprised. He looked at Helvane. He looked at me. He looked at my uniform, which bore the unmistakable stains of my profession, and his nostrils flared once. And he said, "This had better be important." It was important. Helvane presented her medical findings with the cool precision of a woman who dealt in facts and expected facts to be respected. I presented my tunnel survey with the meticulous detail of a clerk who understood that in the administratum, imprecise records were a sin almost equal to heresy. The commissar listened. He did not interrupt. He did not dismiss us. He read the data slate, scrolling through Helvane's charts and my incident report with a methodical thoroughness that told me he was taking it seriously. When we finished, he was quiet for a long time, and the silence was heavy with the kind of potential energy that precedes either an explosion or a decision, and I could not tell which was coming. "How long," he said finally, "have you known about this?" The question was directed at me. 17 days, I said. 17 days. He repeated it without inflection, which was more frightening than if he had shouted, because Commissar Hull was the kind of man who was most dangerous when he was quiet. You discovered evidence of Xenos infiltration beneath this base 17 days ago, and you are only now bringing it to my attention. I opened my mouth to explain, to describe the dismissals and the dead-filed reports, and the chain of command that had swallowed my information and produced nothing, but Helvane spoke first. He reported it through proper channels, Commissar. Sergeant Druvek dismissed it. Major Tessavane acknowledged it and took no action. Given Guardsman Velt's findings regarding the supply diversion and the access point security, the failure of the chain of command to act is itself evidence of the infiltration scope. That was Helvane. Direct, clinical, unafraid of telling a commissar that his regiment's officers were compromised, or at least better at hiding her fear than I was, which was not a high bar. Commissar Hull stood up. He was a tall man, lean, with a face that looked like it had been carved from something harder than flesh and never finished to a polish. He wore his uniform like armor, and the bolt pistol at his hip was not decorative. He looked at me for a long time, long enough that I started to wonder if this was the part where he shot me for failing to report sooner, or for going underground without authorization, or for being a coward, or for any of the 100 other failures that a commissar could decide were worth a bolt round. His hand moved to the bolt pistol, stopped, did not draw. I watched him calculate, in real time, whether the disciplinary value of executing a guardsman who had withheld evidence outweighed the operational value of keeping alive the only man in the regiment who knew where the tunnels went. The calculation came down on operational. He said, "Show me the tunnels." And just like that, for the first time in the entire campaign, someone with authority and a weapon and the will to use both was asking me to lead them underground, and I wanted to refuse. I wanted to say no. I wanted to be the coward I had always been, but the word that came out of my mouth was, "Yes, sir," and I meant it. We went down that night. Not just the three of us. Hull brought his personal detail, 4 hard-faced veterans from the regimental provost section, men in flak armor with the watchful, weather-worn look of soldiers who answered to the commissariat and nobody else. They did not talk. They did not ask questions. They followed the commissar, and the commissar followed me, and I led them down through the access point behind Pit 4 and into the tunnels with my heart in my throat and my hands on my lamp and the absolute certainty that I was going to die, which was at least a familiar feeling by now. I showed them everything: the cult markings in the main trunk, the chamber where the eggs had been, the new access point behind Pit 11 with its Imperial lock, and the supply dump, the hidden junction hub with its carved walls and stacked crates, and the unmistakable evidence of organized, sustained betrayal. The commissar examined it all in silence, his jaw clenched so tight I could see the muscles working under the skin. He picked up one of the ammunition crates, checked the serial number, set it down. He ran his fingers over the carved symbols on the wall. He stood in the center of the hub and looked up into the darkness above, where the domed ceiling disappeared beyond the reach of our lights, and I saw his hand rest on his bolt pistol, and I knew that whatever happened next would be violent and final, and would probably involve a significant number of people dying. We ascended. Back on the surface, in the darkness of the Kelvessik night, the commissar gathered us in a tight circle behind the collapsed wall near Pit 11 and spoke in a voice that was barely above a whisper. "The intelligence section receives regular reports from Sector Command regarding known Genestealer Cult operational patterns," he said. "Standard doctrine when cult infiltration is suspected within an Imperial Guard unit is immediate quarantine, screening, and, if necessary, decimation. The fact that Major Tessavane has not initiated screening protocols, despite receiving Guardsman Velt's report, confirms that battalion command is compromised." He paused, looked at each of us in turn. "This is now a commissarial matter. No one speaks of this to anyone outside this group. No one changes their routine. No one gives any indication that we are aware of the situation. I will contact regimental command through secure channels and request immediate support from the Ordo Xenos liaison attached to sector headquarters. Until that support arrives, we observe and we document, and we do nothing that could trigger the cult into premature action. He looked at me. Guardsman Velt, you will continue your duties. You will maintain the latrines. You will be my eyes and ears in the sanitation zone. If you see anything at all, you report to me directly. Not to your sergeant, not to your officer, not to anyone. To me. I said yes, sir. What else was I going to say? The next 4 days were the longest of my life, which is saying something given that my life had already included 350-some days of digging and limbing and existing in a state of constant low-grade terror. I went about my routine with a hyper-awareness that was new and exhausting. Every face I saw was potentially a cultist. Every soldier who used the latrines, every NCO who barked in order, every officer who walked past without seeing me. Any of them could be part of the infection, and I would not know. I could not know. That was the genius and the horror of the Genestealer Cult. They were invisible because they were ordinary, because they looked like everyone else, because the corruption was on the inside, in the blood and the bones, and the quiet restructuring of the brain that turned loyalty into something else entirely. Fenwick was the only person I spoke to honestly during those 4 days, and even with him I was careful, because Helvain's medical data had not included everyone in the regiment, and Fenwick's twitching, nervous, perpetually frightened exterior could have been covering something just as easily as it could have been genuine. But I needed someone. That is the dirty truth about cowardice. It is lonely, and loneliness is its own kind of fear. And at some point, the fear of being alone with what you know becomes greater than the fear of trusting the wrong person. I told Fenwick about the commissar. I told him about the plan to contact the Ordo Xenos. I told him that we were supposed to act normal and wait and watch, and Fenwick, to his credit, absorbed all of this with the resignation of a man who had always suspected the universe was conspiring to kill him and was now feeling vindicated. "How long do we wait?" he asked. "As long as it takes," I said. He was quiet for a moment, staring at the mud between his boots, and then he said, 5 days, maybe less. That is how long we have." I looked at him. "How do you know that?" He shrugged, that nervous, twitchy shrug of his. "I do not know it. It is a feeling. The camp has a rhythm. Something is changing in the rhythm. Can you not feel it?" I could not feel it. But I told myself that Fenwick's perpetual anxiety had made him sensitive to shifts in atmosphere, the way a sick animal senses a storm before it breaks. A reasonable explanation. The third one. I was collecting them, and I did not even know it. It took too long. On the 5th day, the cult made its move, and everything I had been afraid of came true, all at once, in the space of a single night that I will remember for whatever remains of my life, which may not be long, but will certainly not be boring. It started with the sentries. 3 guard posts on the southern perimeter went silent within minutes of each other between the 2nd and 3rd watch rotation, and nobody noticed because the communications officer on duty was one of them, one of the cultists, compromised, part of the web. And he logged the check-in reports as normal while the guard posts were being overrun from below. The cultists came up through the tunnels, through access points that had been concealed for months, maybe years, emerging into the camp in the dead of night, wearing Imperial uniforms and carrying Imperial weapons, and looking exactly like the men and women they had been sleeping next to for the past year. And behind them, coming up through the wider tunnels, through the ramp behind Pit 11, and through other access points that I had never found, came the hybrids and the pure strains, the things that were not pretending anymore, The things with too many arms and too many teeth and eyes that reflected light like an animal's. I was asleep when it started. I was in my corner of the supply room, wrapped in a blanket that smelled like me, and therefore smelled like something that should have been disposed of weeks ago. And I was having a dream about Pallenvahr, about the Administratum sub-office, and the smell of ink and parchment, and the gentle, boring, beautiful tedium of filing reports that did not matter. And then the shooting started. Last fire, close, inside the camp, not the distant crackling of the front line, but the sharp, immediate, terrifying sound of weapons being discharged between buildings, between hab-blocks, between people who could see each other and were trying to kill each other. I was on my feet before I was fully awake, grabbing for my lasgun, which I had started keeping next to my bunk since the commissar's visit, and then the wall of the supply room exploded inward, and something came through it that was not human, not even close to human, a shape of chitin and claw and shrieking, hissing fury that moved faster than anything that size should have been able to move. It killed the two guardsmen who were sleeping in the far corner before they could reach their weapons. It killed them in ways I do not want to describe, but will describe anyway, because this is my story, and the dead deserve to have their deaths acknowledged even when the deaths are ugly. It tore them apart, with its hands, its claws, its jaws, in seconds. Pieces of men who had been alive and whole and dreaming their own dreams moments before, reduced to components, to meat, to nothing. I did not fight it. I need you to know that. The brave version of this story would have me raising my lasgun and taking aim and bringing the creature down with a well-placed shot. But I did not do that because I am not brave, and I have never claimed to be brave, and the one thing I have always been honest about is my cowardice. What I did was run. I ran through the hole the creature had made in the wall, out into the night, into the chaos of a camp that was tearing itself apart. Last fire everywhere, screams, the wet, meaty sounds of close combat. Explosions from the perimeter where someone had managed to get a heavy weapon firing. Bodies on the ground, some in guardsman uniforms, some in cultist robes, some in things that were worse than either. I ran past a knot of fighting and saw, in the strobe light flicker of last fire, Protin Gulv, the big dock worker, the hero. The man who had bayoneted a Genestealer in close combat and earned the platoon's worship. He was standing in the middle of a crossroads between hab-blocks, and he was not fighting the cultists. He was fighting alongside them. His uniform was torn open at the collar, and in the firelight I could see the skin of his chest, and it was wrong, ridged, mottled, a texture that was not human skin at all, but something between skin and shell. And his mouth was open, and the sound coming out of it was not a battle cry, but a keening, a harmonic that resonated with the same frequency as the cult chanting that was echoing through the camp. The stomach condition. The evidence in his section's latrine that I had noted months ago and filed away and never acted on, because it was not my business. Because I was the shitman, and the shitman did not get involved. His body had been changing. Rejecting food, restructuring itself, becoming something else, and the signs had been right there in the pit I maintained every day, and I had seen them and I had done nothing, because doing nothing was what I was best at. He saw me. For one terrible moment across the chaos of the crossroads, our eyes met, the coward and the hero, the shitman and the legend, and there was nothing of Protin Gulv left in that gaze. Whatever looked at me through his eyes was hungry and old and sure of its purpose in a way that Protin Gulve had never been. Then someone put a list round through his skull from a window above, and he dropped and I kept running. The air tasted like smoke and blood and burned insulation and something else, something chemical and sweet, something I had never smelled before and hoped I would never smell again. I ran for the latrines. I know how that sounds. In the middle of an attack, in the middle of the regiment coming apart at the seams, I ran for the latrines. But I had a reason, and the reason was this. I knew the tunnels. I knew the access points. I knew where they came up and where they went down, and how the network connected beneath the camp. If the cult was using the tunnels to move, then the tunnels were the key, not just to the attack, but to stopping the attack. If someone could get down there, could get to the junction hub, could collapse the main trunk or block the access points, they could cut the cult's supply line, their reinforcement route, their ability to move freely beneath the defenders. And the only person in the regiment who knew the tunnel network well enough to do that was me, the shit man. The coward who dug latrines and cried at the founding and had fired his lasgun exactly 9 times in his entire military career. The universe, I thought as I ran, has a truly appalling sense of humor. I found Fenwick at the latrine pits. He was standing at the edge of pit 11, the one closest to the hidden access point, and he was not running. Everyone else in the camp was either fighting or fleeing or dying, and Fenwick Drosh, the most frightened man in the regiment, the man who had frozen under fire and been sentenced to sanitation duty as punishment for his inability to function in the presence of danger, was standing perfectly still at the edge of a latrine pit, looking down into it with an expression that I had never seen on his face before. He was not afraid. That was the first thing I noticed, and it stopped me dead. In almost a year of knowing Fenwick Drosh, I had never once seen him not afraid. Fear was his defining characteristic, his constant companion, the thing that twitched in his left eye and shook in his hands and hunched his shoulders and made his voice thin and reedy. It was gone. All of it. He was standing straight-backed and still and calm, looking down into the pit, and when he heard me approach, he turned, and his eyes caught the light of a distant fire in a way that was wrong, that was reflective. That was not how human eyes caught light, and something inside me cracked open like a fault line, a truth that had been there all along, waiting for me to see it. Fenwick was one of them. He had always been one of them. Not a pure cultist, not a conscious conspirator, but something worse, a sleeper, a carrier, a vessel for the Patriarch's influence so deeply embedded that the host himself did not know. The nervous twitching, the anxiety, the fear, all symptoms, I realized with a horror that felt like falling, of a mind in constant low-level conflict with something that lived inside it, something that pulled at his thoughts and reshaped his instincts and, occasionally in moments of stress, broke through to the surface. His failure to advance under fire had not been cowardice. It had been the cult's instinct for self-preservation overriding his conscious mind, keeping its vessel safe, keeping it close to the ground, close to the tunnels, close to where it needed to be, and his assignment to latrine detail, right next to the access points, right next to me and my tunnels and my discoveries. That had not been coincidence either. Nothing was coincidence. The cult did not do coincidence. "Fenwick," I said. My voice came out steadier than I expected. Maybe because I had already used up all my fear, or maybe because the thing standing in front of me was so far beyond fear that my brain had given up trying to process it and had defaulted to a kind of numb operational clarity. "Fenwick, can you hear me?" He smiled. It was Fenwick's smile, the thin, uncertain smile of a man who was never sure if the joke was on him, but there was something behind it now, something looking out through his eyes that was and patient, and very, very interested in what I was going to do next. "I always hear you, Cradden," he said, and his voice was Fenwick's voice, but steadier, calmer, without the tremor. Then something shifted, not all at once, but in stages, like watching a mask slip in slow motion. His posture straightened another degree. His jaw moved differently when he spoke, as though the muscles were remembering a configuration they had been suppressing for a very long time. "Even when you do not speak, especially when you do not speak." He took a step toward me. "The water was warm. You remember asking me how I knew? I knew because I have been down there, Cradden. Not with these legs, not through these eyes, but I have been there, in the wet and the dark, and it is beautiful. You would not understand. You saw a nest, and you saw horror. I see a nest, and I see home." Another step. His head tilted just slightly, at an angle that was wrong for a human neck, and his voice dropped to something that was almost tender. "You were never invisible, you know. Not to me, not to the family below. We watched you dig and lime and burn, and we were patient, because patience is what we are. But then you started going down, and you told the man with the pistol, and patience has its limits. Even ours. Ours." He said ours, and the word hung in the air between us like a blade. And I understood. The warm water, the direction he walked on his first day, the 5 days he predicted with such certainty. The cult had known. They had known about my explorations, about my reports, about the commissar's visit. They had known because Fenwick had been there, watching, listening, reporting back through channels that had nothing to do with Vox links or data slates, and everything to do with the psychic web that connected every node of a Genestealer cult to its patriarch. Fenwick had been my companion, my confidant, my only friend, and he had been their eyes the entire time. Every word I had said to him, every fear I had shared, every discovery I had described, all of it had gone straight to the thing that lived beneath the camp, the thing that breathed in the dark. I had been the shit man. I had been the fool. I had been the coward who thought he was being brave. And all along I had been a tool, a mechanism by which the cult tracked the one genuine threat to its concealment. And the reasonable explanations I had accepted, every single one of them, had been the bait I swallowed willingly because I was too lonely and too desperate for a friend to look at the hook. Fenwick took another step. He was close now, close enough that I could see the subtle changes in his face that I had missed for a year, because I had not been looking, because nobody looks at the latrine man's assistant, because both of us had been invisible, and that was exactly what the cult wanted. The slight elongation of his jaw, the faint ridge along his temples, the way his fingers moved with a fluidity that was just a fraction too smooth, too jointed, too many degrees of freedom. He was not fully turned. He was a hybrid, 3rd or 4th generation, human enough to pass but changed enough to serve, and the thing behind his eyes was reaching for me, not with hands, but with the pressure of a mind that was not alone, that was part of something vast and hungry and very close. I shot him. I raised my lasgun, the weapon I had fired 9 times in training and 0 times in combat, and I shot Fenwick Drosh in the chest from a distance of about 2 meters, and the last bolt punched through his sternum and out the back of his flak jacket, and he went down into the mud beside latrine pit number 11 with an expression of genuine surprise, and the thing behind his eyes flickered and faded, and what was left was just Fenwick, confused, hurt, dying, looking up at me with the old fear back in his eyes, the real Fenwick, the frightened man who had sat next to me and eaten rations and said, "That is worse," when I stopped going underground, and I watched the light go out of his eyes, and I felt something inside me break that I do not think will ever be fixed. That was the 10th shot. The first one that counted. The first one that took something from me that I cannot get back. I did not have time to grieve. The camp was still under attack. The tunnels were still open. And I knew with the clarity of a man who has lost everything except the ability to act, what I needed to do. The supply dump in the junction hub had included ammunition crates and explosive charges, enough to collapse the main tunnel junction if they were detonated in the right place. The clerk's brain, still functioning despite everything, had already calculated the load-bearing vulnerabilities of the junction hub's domed ceiling. If the hub collapsed, it would seal the primary intersection of the tunnel network, cutting the cult's main route beneath the camp. It would not stop the attack. It would not save everyone. But it would slow them down, and in a war of attrition, slowing down was the difference between a defeat and a rout. I went down, through the access point behind Pit 11, down the ramp into the tunnels for what I told myself would be the last time. I moved fast, faster than I had ever moved underground, half running through the dark with my lamp in one hand and my lasgun in the other, and Fenwick's blood on my uniform mixing with all the other stains that marked me as the shit man, the latrine man, the invisible man who dug holes for other people and was finally digging one for something that mattered. The tunnels were alive with movement. I could hear them. Feet in the water, voices in the dark, the scraping of chitin on rockcrete. But I was moving through subsidiary channels that the main force was not using, side tunnels and maintenance shafts that I had mapped in my head during my unauthorized expeditions, and the knowledge that I had gathered in fear was now the thing keeping me alive. I reached the junction hub. It was not empty. Something crouched in the far curve of the wall, half submerged in the shallow water at the hub's edge. And when my lamplight swept across it, it raised its head and looked at me, and I recognized it. Not the specific creature, I had never seen this one before, but the sound, the wet, rasping breathing. This was what I had heard in the egg chamber weeks ago, the thing in the dark that had let me live. A purestrain. Huge, coiled, glistening, its chitin the color of old bone, its 4 arms folded against its torso like a mantis at rest. But something was wrong with it. One of its lower arms hung at an angle that even I could tell was broken, the chitin cracked and weeping something dark and viscous, and a blackened wound on its flank. Last burn, fresh from the fighting above, had fused 2 of its armor plates together in a way that locked its torso at a slight twist. It had been up there. It had fought and been wounded and come back down, and now it was between me and the crates, and it watched me with eyes that were black and deep and utterly without anything I could call emotion. I did the thing I am least qualified to do in the entire scope of human activity. I fought. I raised my lasgun and I fired. Not carefully, not with aim, not with anything resembling marksmanship, but with the frantic point-blank desperation of a man who has exactly one chance and knows it. The first shot hit the wall behind it. The second hit its wounded flank and it screamed, a sound that was part shriek and part hiss, and part something that I felt in my teeth rather than heard with my ears. And it launched itself at me, slower than it should have been, that broken arm trailing, that fused torso limiting its reach. But still fast, still terrifyingly fast, and its good claw caught me across the chest and opened my flak jacket like paper and drew a line of fire from my collarbone to my hip. I fell backward into the water. It came down on top of me. I jammed the last gun barrel against the crack in its flank armor and fired 3 times, 4 times, directly into the wound, and something inside it ruptured and it spasmed and rolled off me and lay thrashing in the shallow water, its limbs cycling, its jaw opening and closing on nothing. I scrambled back, gasping, bleeding, the water around me turning pink, and I fired again into its skull from a meter away. And it stopped. It stopped, and I stood over it, shaking so badly that the last gun was rattling against its own stock, blood running freely down my chest and dripping from my fingers, and the hub was quiet except for the sound of my breathing and the distant rumble of the battle above. The crates were still there, still stacked, still organized. The cult had already moved its fighters up into the camp and had not expected anyone to come down here. Not now, not during the attack. Before I touched the crates, I tore a strip from the ruin of my flak jacket and bound it tight around my chest. It was a clumsy job. The fabric was already soaked through within the minute, and the pressure made me dizzy enough that I had to lean against one of the columns to stay on my feet. But it slowed the bleeding enough to keep my hands working, and that was all I needed. I set the charges. 4 crate-sized explosive packages positioned at the base of the 4 main load-bearing columns that supported the domed ceiling, wired together with detonation cord from the engineering supplies that the cult had so thoughtfully stockpiled. I am not a demolitions expert. I was a clerk, and then I was a latrine digger, and now I was apparently a saboteur. But the sanitation handbook had a chapter on contaminated waste incineration, slow-burn pyres for plague-tainted material, set with delayed timer fuses so the burning detail could withdraw before the fire took. The Munitorum wanted it done by the book, even when the book was insane. And a timer is a timer, whether you are starting a fire or finishing one. The wiring was crude. The timers were improvised from components I scavenged from a communications kit. But the clerk's brain was good with systems and connections and making things work in the right order, and when I armed the charges and set the delay for 3 minutes and started running back the way I had come, I was reasonably confident. Not certain, because certainty is a luxury that cowards cannot afford, but reasonably confident that the junction hub was about to cease to exist. I was 200 meters up the tunnel when the charges blew. The sound was enormous, a physical force that picked me up and threw me face first into the tunnel wall. And then the shockwave passed and the rumbling started, deep and grinding, the sound of tons of rockcrete and compacted earth collapsing into the void where the junction hub had been. The tunnel shook, cracks raced along the ceiling. Water surged around my legs as the shockwave displaced it through the network. I ran like I had never run before, leaving a trail of pink water behind me where the bandage had soaked through and then through again, not away from danger this time, but toward something, toward the surface, toward the light, toward the world above where men were fighting and dying and where the collapse of the hub would mean something, would change something, would matter. The tunnel behind me was falling in, sections of ceiling dropping like the Emperor's own judgment, and the darkness was chasing me, and I was faster, just barely, just enough. And I hit the ramp behind Pit 11 and scrambled up on hands and knees and burst out into the night air of Kelvessik Four and collapsed in the mud next to Fenwick's body and lay there gasping while the ground beneath me groaned and settled and went still. The battle lasted until dawn. I know this because I was conscious for most of it, lying in the mud beside the latrines, watching the fires and the last light and the shapes moving between the buildings, too exhausted to move and too awake to sleep. At some point during the night, someone knelt beside me, a medic, a passing guardsman. I never saw his face, and cut my soaked bandage off and put a real field dressing on the wound and said something I could not hear over the ringing in my ears. And then he was gone, and I was bleeding less, and that was all the help I would get until morning. The collapse of the junction hub did what I had hoped it would do. It cut the cult's underground reinforcement route, trapping the fighters who had already surfaced and preventing the reserves below from joining them. Commissar Hull, who had survived the initial attack and rallied what remained of the loyal elements of 3rd Battalion, led the counterattack. It was brutal. It was close quarters, building to building, room to room fighting against an enemy that looked like your comrade right up until the moment it killed you. But with their tunnel network severed and their element of surprise spent, the cultists were outnumbered and outgunned, and by the time the gray dawn light of Kelvessik crept over the ruined skyline of Ossendrath, it was over. Not finished, not resolved, but over in the sense that the immediate killing had stopped, and the survivors could stand in the wreckage and take stock of what was left. What was left was not much. 3rd Battalion had taken over 40% casualties. Major Tessavain was dead, killed by Commissar Hull personally, a bolt round through the skull, summary execution for treason against the Imperium. Lieutenant Prothvin was dead. Gelf, the Munitorum liaison who had been skimming medical supplies that, as it turned out, had been finding their way down into the tunnels along with everything else the cult was hoarding, was found face down in his quarters with his throat opened from ear to ear, killed in the way the cult killed assets who had outlived their usefulness, and the investigation into his death was filed under cult activity and closed within the hour. Captain Morvain was dead, though whether he had been killed by the cult or by the loyalists was never determined. They found a journal in his quarters afterwards, half the pages soaked in whatever he had been drinking. The parts that were legible told a story I recognized, a man who had suspected the tunnels were wrong during the initial survey, who had raised concerns that were quietly redirected by Major Tessavain's staff, who had spent 10 months watching the chain of command bury what he had tried to surface. He had not been compromised. He had been silenced, and the drinking was the sound a man makes when he knows something terrible and cannot make anyone listen. I understood that sound. I had been making it myself in my own way for months. The difference between Morvain and me was that he drowned his knowledge in a bottle, and I buried mine in a latrine pit, and only one of those strategies turned out to have a future. Fenwick Drosh was dead, and the entry in the casualty log listed him as killed in action by hostile Xenos forces, and I did not correct it because the truth was worse and would not help anyone, and some things are better left in the mud where they fell. I survived. I survived the attack and the battle and the aftermath. Surgeon Lieutenant Helvain survived too. She had barricaded herself in the medicae station with 3 orderlies and a laspistol she had never fired before, and she held that position for 6 hours, treating the wounded who crawled to her door while the camp burned around her. She was the second person to be cleared by the Ordo Xenos screening, after the commissar himself. I survived the weeks of screening and quarantine that followed as the Ordo Xenos finally arrived and began the slow, painful process of identifying and removing the cult's surviving elements from the regiment. I was screened 3 times. Blood tests, psychic probes, physical examinations that went far beyond anything the regimental medicae had conducted. I passed every test, clean. Human, uncompromised, just a man, just a coward who dug latrines and stumbled into something bigger than himself and did the one thing he never expected to do, which was act. Commissar Hull put me in for a commendation. I do not know if it was ever processed. The administratum works slowly, and the paperwork for a commendation is considerable, and I suspect that a recommendation from a commissar for a guardsman on latrine detail was probably filed in the same kind of dead log where Lieutenant Prothvin had put my original tunnel report. These things have a symmetry to them, but that is not the end of the story. The end of the story is this. After the screening, after the quarantine, after the replacements arrived, and the 47th Pallenvahr was reconstituted, and the campaign on Kelvessik Four ground forward again, I was offered a transfer. Surgeon Lieutenant Helvain arranged it. A posting to the battalion command staff, an administrative role, a clerk's position doing exactly the kind of work I had done before the founding. Filing reports, managing records, stamping documents. Safe, clean, respected. Everything I had wanted. Everything my cowardice had been aimed at from the moment I raised my hand on the transport deck. I turned it down. I said no. The word came out before I had time to think about it, which was new for me because I used to think about everything, used to calculate and weigh and measure every decision against the metric of my own survival. But something had changed. The morning I made my decision, I was walking past the new latrine pits. Some replacement guardsmen's work. Sloppy, the drainage all wrong, the lime ratios clearly guesswork. And I saw a young soldier sitting on the edge of one crying. Quiet crying, the kind you do when you think nobody is watching. He was fresh from the transport, a replacement. Soft hands, curved spine, the look of a man who had been a clerk or a scribe or something equally harmless before the Imperium decided it needed his body more than his brain. He looked exactly like me the day of the founding. Exactly. And I stood there watching him, and I realized that the person I was afraid of becoming, the body on the ground, the name in the casualty log, the man who did not come back, was better than the person I had already been. I had been safe for a year. I had been invisible and disgusting and beneath notice and safe, and I had been miserable. And the misery had been a price I was willing to pay because the alternative was danger, and danger meant death. But then danger came anyway. It came up through the ground under my feet, through the tunnels I had mapped, through the eyes of the one man I trusted. And safety was revealed for what it had always been. An illusion. A latrine pit with boards over it, hiding what was underneath, pretending the hole was not there. I walked over to the replacement. I crouched next to him. I said, "The drainage is wrong. Move it 2 meters east, or it will flood in the first rain." He looked up at me with red eyes and a bewildered expression, and I said, "You will be fine. Just do not volunteer for anything." And then I walked away to request my transfer. I went back to the line. Not the latrines. The line. I asked for a transfer to a fighting platoon, and Sergeant Druvek, who had dismissed my reports and called me shitman and never once looked at me as anything more than a piece of sanitation equipment, stared at me for a long time and then nodded and said, "Welcome to 2nd Platoon, Velt." He used my name, my real name. I did not cry this time. I wanted to, but the part of me that cried had been replaced by something harder, something that had been forged in the dark under the camp, in the chamber where the eggs had been, in the moment when I pulled the trigger on the only friend I had ever had in the Imperial Guard. I was still afraid. I want to be clear about that. I was still afraid, and I am still afraid now, every day, every time the last fire starts, and the shouting begins, and the world turns into noise and death. I will always be afraid. But I no longer believe that fear is a reason not to act. I no longer believe that the safest place is the right place. I no longer believe that being invisible is the same as being alive. My name is Cradden Velt. I was a clerk. I was a coward. I was the shit man. And I dug the most important hole of my life, not in the ground, but in the dark beneath it, and what I buried there was the man I used to be.